welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us as we are continuing our journey through the Daodejing, and we are currently in chapter 61. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. So I'm going to start with a question. If you think about a large or great nation, what kinds of things does that nation need?
Food.
Needs food? Okay.
I mean, the people need food.
Yes. So let's say you're starting from scratch. What do you need to end up being a great nation or a large nation?
Hmm.
I would say a government with checks and balances.
You need a large swath of connected land.
Dwayne said people in the chat.
Ah, very good. Yes, got to have people. That would even be before the government and maybe even
Yeah, that's like
before the
step
land.
0.
Yeah. And actually, even though that sounds kind of basic, it was especially in the ancient world a true thing because uh, in a lot of places where you had big cities, you had a lot of other issues, whether it was sanitation issues or um, like combative issues, poor building standards. In any case, what happened is that your life expectancy was a lot shorter in the city. And so you had to constantly attract people. It's kind of interesting. You don't think about that as much today because we think of the big city, but even still, there's a lot that we are seeing once the remote first kind of options popped up. A lot of people stopped going into the cities, right? And we see a lot of empty office buildings and a lot of stores and everything have shut down because they just simply don't have the people coming into the city like they used to. So a key thing actually is people, that you have to have an ability to attract people into a city for it to exist. And that's a little bit about where this chapter is headed. And I'm glad we kind of stumbled upon that idea, Dwayne, before we got started, because it really helps to illustrate what's happening here. So here we go. A great nation flows down. Now, a couple things. As usual, we're going to see some contrary opinions being expressed here in the Daodejing. Normally, when we think about something that's great, we think about something that is up high or something that's exalted. So here they're saying a great nation flows down. And we can pick up from the idea of flows and down that there's this idea of rivers or streams that have been a symbolism that's been used prior in the Tao Te Ching, especially in the chapter where it starts off saying, be like water. So there's already kind of an inversion of what we would normally think of in terms of that great being exalted. Here it's being talked about as something that flows down to be the world's pool. So if we think about why water flows down, it's because you end up with some type of valley or something that comes down to this low point, right? And the water collects, whether it's an ocean or a lake or something along those lines, a valley. And that's also a symbolism that we've seen previously, where it talks about how things are gathered into valleys, and valleys tend to be very bountiful because there's all these resources that flow into them, right? And you have another very interesting identification with the valley, and that is with the female. And we see that here as well, the female under heaven. So if we think about the question of the nation, then here they're identifying a great nation as something that is positioned low, that allows all these resources to flow down into it, and that it is depicted as the female. So many things are turned on its head. Whereas typically we think of things that are great in terms of being elevated, in terms of being masculine, in terms of like this power or this ability. And here they're kind of flipping it upside down, saying that a truly great nation is one in which all the resources flow or are attracted to it. And the way that it's depicting this being attracted to it is this idea of this great female that is attracting all these things together in this way that the valley did, in the way of, this bountifulness or this generativeness. It's a very interesting opening picture here. So maybe before we go to the next section, I'm curious if you had any thoughts or comments on this. Okay, then we will continue.
I think that's brewing, but I'm not ready yet.
And that's an interesting point, because I'd have to say with this one, I felt it at more of a visceral level as I was going through. I had to really take some time to think about how to express what I was feeling versus simply being able to explain it. It kind of hit at a different level, especially in this next section here. In stillness, the female constantly overcomes the male. In stillness, takes the lower place. Now, we've got a couple of things we need to be aware of when we're looking at things that come from the ancient world. There's definitely some stereotypes that are coming into play, and some different ways they're thinking about, in particular, the sexual union between female and male and how these things play out. So one thing we need to just know about this section is it is not specifically about man and woman, because the term that's being used is actually for different like animal species. So there's a way of talking about this just in terms of like the way nature works. It's not that it's exclusive or doesn't apply to the male female world, but that maybe there's a broader implication, and we don't want to read too much into it specifically in that sense. But there is something to this unique dynamic between males and females and how they interact with each other. And of course, this is going to be using very stereotypical ways of talking about things. And I know there's a lot of concerns about using that type of language in today's world. So we'll just have to put on our time travel caps here for a minute and realize that we're dealing with a very different time and place. And we'll try to understand it from that perspective, not necessarily trying to make implications that this is how we want to talk about it in our modern world. Or maybe we do, I don't know, but I'm not trying to make that call today. So, and it was interesting that we just finished up at the same time I was going through this chapter, the series on Hulu called Shogun. Did anybody else happen to watch that? Very good. Highly recommend it.
I watched the original and read the book
Well,
way back in the day.
yeah. My wife was a big fan of the book as well. She thought that the remake was far better than the first miniseries they made. But in any case, it's, without doing much in the way of spoilers here, there's a lot that hinges on the different social roles and how they play out, and the contrast with a Westerner finding himself in Japan in the 1600s and just being completely culturally baffled between the two, and the strong sense of things like loyalty and propriety and especially the male-female relations and how they functioned. But there was this subtle way of doing things. There's like the more obvious way, of course, of the men using strength or power or belligerence to try and accomplish something. And that was seen as a little bit more of the like less wise way to approach things. And then there was a more subtle kind of undercurrent of how they would approach things. And in particular, in the role that women played. And this isn't to say, I mean, they definitely are making cultural critiques or exploring different cultural patterns, I'll say, in this movie between how people exist in each of those. And it's not saying that one was better than the other, but that they're different and they have different ways of functioning. But one of the things that comes out in that show, but in many different places, is how the female has the ability, in a sense, to kind of conquer this masculine aggression. Uh, and we see this come out in shows and movies all the time. There's, within the police story, there's always this, what they call it, a honey trap, right? Where they use some beautiful woman to get somebody off guard or get him to reveal something. Or even in King Kong, what's that line at the end of it? It was beauty that killed the beast. And so there's an aspect of that that's coming into play here, that there's one other thing that's kind of funny, just popped in my head. Years ago, I used to have to carpool more, and I think there was like a psychology call-in show or something that must have been on the radio that I got pulled into. And the host was saying something like, men are just like dogs. They just want to be petted. You pet them and they'll treat you like they'll follow you around, they'll be loyal to you. And, it's funny because as a man, uh, I definitely can see how these different things apply. I know that a lot of them are stereotypical, but sometimes they're stereotypical because they broadly apply. There's definitely different ways I respond to people in terms of how they're, treating me. And certainly this, the different concepts that are coming up in all these different things definitely can impact males in a particular way. And they're playing to that here, right? That there's this idea of this stillness and this idea of lowness. And, low they're talking about here in terms of not rank necessarily, but in terms of like physical position, right? Taking the lower place. So it's interesting how they're bringing this in as the ideal for the great nation. So we've talked about how there's this yin yang polarity, and that the yang is the bright side that has to do with more the masculine aspects. It has to do with this idea of control, has to do with this idea of force. And then there's the yin, that is the darker side, that has to do with the feminine, that has to do with chaos, but chaos in the sense of newness, novelty, generativeness, new things coming into being. And these things kind of are not antagonistic to each other, but they are complementary to each other. But when you get one out of balance, if there's too much yang coming into play, then there's too much control, there's too much aggression. That can be problematic. And if you have too much of the yin, then things can be too chaotic. They can be too unpredictable. And so there's this balance that is needed. And part of what we see within the Daodejing is its social critique of what has been happening during this warring states period, is that there's been a little too much yang going on, that the aggression and the control has gotten out of control, and it's bringing about this chaos. And how we return it is to actually increase more of that yin concept. And here we see very strongly the female being held up as more of the ideal in this situation. The other thing that's kind of interesting that I was becoming more aware of is we've talked about the Warring States period, but there's a period prior to this called the Spring and Autumn. And it's really at that point that we have the beginning of when the Zhou dynasty is really breaking down, and kind of the start of this whole Warring States period really goes back to that time frame, which means that this time of social chaos really spans more about 500 years instead of 200. And specifically with what we're going to see in this chapter, this must have been in relation to that prior state, because what happens a little bit later, well, let's get to the next section. We'll explain that. But right here, we just want to understand how, again, they're really turning the tables upside down as looking to the female as the ideal for how the great nation should be acting. Any thoughts about that before we continue?
Yeah, I think it makes me think of when you're building a building, right? Like a tall building, and you want it to be able to sway a little bit with the wind so that it doesn't just fall over. And I think, like, as far as the female energy goes, I feel like it's more like yielding and just accommodating and more calm. And it kind of reminds me of that sentiment of like being able to be flexible and adapt to kind of what's thrown at you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if we think about the prior point about cities needing people and a way of attracting them, it's kind of interesting how this plays into that, right? That there's a different type of a stance that is taken in order to attract people. It really makes you think a lot about several chapters in this part of the book where it's going into more government things, and it talks about rulership as in terms of thinking about farming, or in the last chapter about cooking a small fish and how these things come into play. And one of the things that's consistent with those is this idea of how do we create a nourishing context, one that's going to foster growth. And in how the farmer works, there's ways that they can do that that's going to be sustainable, that's going to feed the soil, and it's going to produce. And other ways, as it says, when the Tao is forgotten, that all of a sudden the fields are left in disarray and the granaries are empty. So there's a nurturing aspect of how this generativeness that happens in that valley, from that idea of that female energy, that needs to be acknowledged and incorporated into how these larger structures play. If we think about modern business, I've been really thinking about this farmer parallel, especially in terms of thinking about our modern concern with things like topsoil and how that's becoming really a crucial issue in thinking about the future, and even about it's odd how many things this actually impacts. But it's like businesses or countries or different organizations, how they organize things, they're all made up of people. And I see the relationship here of like the soil being like the people. And there's different approaches. One that just doesn't care about the soil, they just think of it as dirt, that it's just a medium in which to grow the important thing. And when you have that type of an approach, like the factory farming, you end up destroying that topsoil. You end up killing it. It's a living thing and it dies. And ultimately, you won't be able to produce unless you start, bringing in all sorts kinds of chemical fertilizers and so forth to try and get it to continue to produce. But you end up destroying the ground. And it's a very short-sighted way of looking at how do we gain profit from this thing, or how do we gain whatever we're trying to do. But if you're actually paying attention to recognizing that the long-term health requires that topsoil, and that it is a living thing and it needs to be fed and nurtured, and that's what's going to continue to allow things to be produced, then if we were to take more of that approach, it would be more of a people first aspect. So sometimes there's an interesting book called Start With Why, Simon Sinek, I think it is. And he really talks about this idea of people first companies, not customer first and not, product first, but people first companies, and how they do well because they're actually feeding the people, right? The people are the source of everything, and they're not just dealt with as this disposable resource. So we see all these things coming together in these chapters, and especially this one here, where it's really focusing on this feminine aspect about that generative nature, that the nurturing aspect, and how you need to cultivate more of that valley way of thinking about things instead of the pyramid. It's like the reverse, where we tend to, again, elevate and think of things as high up and things that are powerful and have this control aspect. And they're turning this all on its head. And again, really having a stronger emphasis on thinking about the value of people and how the people are actually able to do a lot of the governing themselves if you empower them. And that the role of the government isn't how to control everything, but how to create a context in which things flourish. I was just listening to an interesting podcast recently where this guy is talking about different business strategies. And he says, if you're coming up with a bunch of silly rules at your company, like don't come to work drunk, or no watching Netflix while you're doing a customer call, he's like, you got a problem. The problem is you don't have, a context in which people are thriving, right? That you shouldn't have to tell people those things. And if you're having to tell people those things, you've got a bigger problem than just the particular individuals. And I think this kind of ties into that same kind of an idea here. So therefore, a great nation lowers itself and wins over a small one. A small nation keeps itself low and wins over a great one. So interesting how this strategy is being applied in both contexts, both a great nation and a small nation, and they both have this powerful way of attracting each other. And this is where the scholars are saying this probably had to have taken place more in the spring and autumn period, because this is when a lot of these smaller states were kind of gobbled up by the bigger ones that end up then really going to war with each other during the Warring States period. So this is probably going back a little bit, still in this time of social chaos when things are at war with one another. And here we see the strategy that they're suggesting, that this great nation, if it is positioning itself in the proper way, it's actually going to attract these smaller nations. They're going to want to flow into it. And there's kind of this mutual benefit of what the great nation then can offer the small nation, and also what the small nation can offer the great nation. And both of them achieve their mutual goals when they're both taking on this similar stance, which is this lower position, this idea of, again, that more feminine, that nurturing, that attracting, that way of being that is going to produce a context in which everything is able to thrive. I think the other thing we need to keep in mind here too is the overall thought within, classical China is that there should be, like, the ideal is that there's one giant empire, right? That they didn't necessarily have the goal of let's have a bunch of small independent city states that are all working together. The goal was, how do I have one big harmonious all under heaven way of functioning? So that's another piece we have to keep in mind here. I know that in more contemporary thinking, scalability is seen as potentially a problem, and where maybe what we need is more smaller self-sustaining ways of organizing things that cooperate with each other rather than trying to figure out how to put everything under one umbrella. But within this context, if they're looking at this larger overarching umbrella over everything, then how they see this coming together in more of this harmonious way is bringing out these ways of interacting and presenting and thinking about rulership and governing that is more on the yin side.
I have some thoughts.
Yeah, please.
It's the more I like kind of zoom out on this, it's interesting to think that maybe like the larger nation could be a man, and the smaller nation could be a woman. And maybe for the larger nation, it's like you can win over smaller nations by showing humility and being flexible, and the smaller nations can win over the larger nations by like by winning favor, like finding ways that are not aggressive to, I don't know, to win them over. It's
Mhm.
like showing how that balance can work for both.
Yeah, they each have a little bit of a different need, right? So the larger country, in a sense, needs the smaller ones, but the smaller one also needs the bigger one, right? Maybe we're thinking
Yeah.
in terms of like protection or something. So
Yeah,
they're,
it's like the more masculine energy. So like the greater nation could use the balance of the smaller, like more feminine energy, and the small nation could use more balance of the like larger, more masculine energy.
Mhm. I'm surprised that this isn't a little bit more of a controversial concept, but maybe we've all been wrestling with these ideas long enough that it's starting to make some sense.
Well, it reminds me a bit of kind of in interpersonal relationships. I think the term is used that sometimes you are more successful if you come at a conflict from a one down position rather than a one up position. I think
Mm,
that might be speaking to that to some degree.
hmm.
I've never heard that before.
Yeah, there's what's that other one? You can attract more flies with honey or something like that.
Yeah, I've heard that one. Me
Yeah.
and Armando use that a lot.
Hmm.
I kind of saw what might be an example of this recently. Um, if anybody's been following uh the Terrence Howard on Joe Rogan fiasco. Basically, Terrence Howard went on Joe Rogan the first time and spewed a bunch of nonsense, and scientists are all going, "This is all nonsense," and non-scientists, people without technical educations, are going, "Wow, this guy's a genius. He knows everything. He's going to revolutionize physics." Because he said things like 1 × 1 = 2, and your calculator's been lying to you, but the government doesn't want you to know, and stuff like that. And then several weeks later, uh, Eric Weinstein, who's a mathematical physicist by training, appeared on Joe Rogan with Terrence Howard and sort of tried very gently to correct some of Terrence Howard's ideas. But I and a lot of other people with like a scientific background watched it and thought he was way too nice. He was way too gentle. He was like, "Oh, Terrence, you're so smart. You're smart in all these ways," and he was praising him, and it seemed like he was just way too humble. He was giving him way more respect than he deserved. Uh, but I realized um, that that's the only thing that would have worked, because if it had been confrontational, um, because basically Terrence Howard is just like really in it for the ego strokes and wanting people to tell him he's smart. And if anybody tells him he's wrong, he takes it as an attack. Like he sent a paper to Neil deGrasse Tyson, and Neil deGrasse Tyson said, "No, this is wrong," and he took it as an attack. So I was actually very impressed with the way this like really really smart guy, way smarter than Terrence Howard, was able to humble himself and kind of show respect and praise and because I realized nothing else would have worked. Like taking that approach, he actually sort of like earned some respect and earned the ability to then like put his foot down a little bit and say, "No, Terrence, you're wrong," and have him actually listen. But it was an example of how I thought it took just a huge amount of confidence and humility to kind of come from this lower position, um, in a situation where being confrontational obviously would not have worked.
Yeah, I remember watching a lot of this unfold, and I definitely had some fun watching your responses to it, Dane. It was definitely something that stirred some interest in you. But there was something you just now said that I think is also really important, in that the ability for Eric Weinstein to come from that perspective was based in his confidence, right? That it when we when we're not coming from a position of confidence, that's, I think, where we tend to be more aggressive. If we're very solid in where we're coming from, it's easier for us to be more relaxed because we're not as concerned about something being, let's say, proven wrong, or something along those lines. And that it's a sign of strength, in a sense, to be able to be humble, because you're not in fear of whatever being taken apart or destroyed. You can afford to have that confidence to humble yourself. And that's, I think, a key aspect too.
I think of it as being resourced. A person who is resourced, who has their needs overall met, is able to humble themselves and approach a situation without having to get their needs met from that situation, or from that person or whatever. And a person who's not resourced is has a much harder time being humble, because there's some need that they are needing to have met.
Yeah. 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 There's some of the other passages that we've seen earlier in the Daodejing, there's a recognition, like, between the sage and the non-sage, that the sage actually comes from the non-sage, and that there's a transformation that can happen, and an understanding that happens, that everything is actually interrelated in that sense. And so there's not so much an adversarial role as much as there is like a nurturing role. And I think that's a really good example of seeing that put into practice. So that, yeah, that's a great example you brought up.
Yeah, I think it happens a lot like that. Like when people feel, I mean, he obviously feels attacked if somebody criticizes him, right? But maybe he doesn't feel safe when people criticize him. So he was provided that safe space by being told, you are smart, but also you're wrong. Like both can be true, and that's okay.
Yeah. You can think about, like a managerial situation when the manager is not very confident in their position, or maybe they feel that the people beneath them maybe know more than they do about certain things. Then their management style can be very harsh, and one that's very controlling. But when the manager is much more confident in themselves and has more confidence in their people, then it's a very different situation, how corrections are made, or how the leadership happens. It's one that's much more affirming and helping other people to grow, rather than trying to keep everybody down in order to maintain my illusion of my own status, kind of a thing. Yeah.
I remember in my professional career, I used to, one thing that served me well was I would always say to myself when I was working for a fool, as sometimes happened, that it is in my best interest not to let the fool know that I know he or she is a fool.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot of like Dale Carnegie, how to win friends and influence people,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, let's see where this goes next then. Sometimes becoming low wins, sometimes staying low wins. So I like the way this translation puts it, because both sides are then benefiting from this low position, whether it's the larger or the greater nation becoming low, or the smaller nation staying low. There's benefit to both of those approaches. And then it really kind of tries to bring together why all this matters. A great nation desires nothing more than to unite and protect people. So here we can see where the smaller nation is potentially going to be able to benefit from the larger nation, in the sense that maybe they're needing that protection from some other outside concern, or maybe it's even in terms of how they are dealing with environmental concerns, whether it's the production of food or maybe natural disaster or something like that. A small nation desires nothing more than to enter the service of people. So, and this can be translated in some different ways, but one of them is that there's this idea of wanting to actually serve the larger nation. Like there's a reciprocal way that these things work, where the larger nation is providing the security, the resources, and the smaller one in exchange is actually providing service. And so you get kind of this natural balance. Another part that's not brought out in this translation, which is a little bit harder to see directly, is there's this idea of boundaries that's being addressed. And there could be this thought that the large nation is not overstepping its boundaries and the small nation is not overstepping its boundaries. So there's this idea that they understand their place and what their role is, and they're staying to that. And because of that, this harmonious relationship can develop, because there's not this overstepping that's going on. So if we think about like the previous chapter, a lot of the idea with the small fish is that there's a lot of non-interference, that it's not getting into trying to control the nitty-gritty type stuff. And so some of those same types of themes are coming through here too. When both get what they wish, the great one should be low. So I think one of the key takeaways I get from this one is that the initiation has to begin with the one that is coming from a more powerful position. That the first step is for that more powerful position to humble itself, rather than trying to look at that the small nation is where this needs to begin. Again, both need to be doing their parts, but there's, in a sense, kind of a, for this whole thing to begin, you have to start from the more powerful side taking that position before everything can unfold. Interesting chapter. I'll go ahead and stop sharing now, and we can see if there's any additional thoughts or things people would like to talk about. We've got a few minutes left. We went through this one a little bit quickly.
I definitely hear a lot of calling for the need to balance yin and yang.
How much of this do you think is applicable to a modern context? Or do you see this as something that could actually work?
I think so, if people would let it. The problem is people only really want control at this point. And I think we could do with more people realizing that letting go of that can actually be very rewarding and pay off.
What do you think's behind not wanting to let go of that control or trying to gain control? Or what drives that type of behavior?
Fear and greed.
It's interesting when we think about greed, that can even go back to the idea of fear too, right? In the sense that why are we trying to collect excessive resources is maybe because we have those fears about survival, and that's seen as the strategy for how we approach that.
Yeah.
Jim, have you heard of those? Well, the study with the mice that will push a lever to get cocaine until they die, basically, if they don't have any kind of social support, if they're like in a barren cage and lonely. But if you design a sort of a mouse heaven with all kinds of mice and place for them to play and everything that mice need to be happy and live together, then they'll just ignore the cocaine.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is so sad and so happy at the same time.
Yeah. No, that particular study has really impacted me in a lot of my thinking, because when we think a lot of about like substance abuse that happens in our culture, we tend to think about addiction and those kinds of things at an individual level, as opposed to seeing that this is a way of essentially self-medicating, of trying to figure out, how do I continue in a hopeless situation? And that when there's more of a hopeful situation in place, that those same opportunities don't have the same type of hold. It's, there, what was the one? I think it might have been the oxytocin, that's one of the big narcotics that gets abused, that in hospital settings, like when, let's say, somebody breaks their hip or something like that, that this is something that's very effective at helping with managing that pain. But not everybody ends up becoming like addicted to it, that it tends to be, you know, well, I don't want to say tends to be, because I don't have enough data on this, but there's ways in which these things, even though it's to everybody, has the same essentially like addictive potential, but for some people they can use it for that pain management and it's fine, but for others it becomes very problematic. And maybe there's some genetic predispositions to addictions or how those things happen, but I think with a lot of our genetic predispositions, there's more of that epigenetic level, right, where the context is going to help determine whether or not those particular gene sequences get expressed, and that the context of a hopeful, fulfilling life has a lot to do with how people are more prone to be attracted to these methods of escape, which I think is a lot of what that I don't know if it was a rat or a mouse study, with the cocaine and kind of the mouse Disneyland come into play.
I've come to realize that a lot of human behavior can be understood through the context of dopamine, which I've learned a lot about from Andrew Huberman's podcast. But basically, oxytocin is the bonding neurotransmitter, and has to do with like bonding between people and with pets and babies and things like that. I don't know how it relates to and specifically to like dopamine, but when you're talking about painkillers, there are like uppers and downers, and painkillers are downers, generally depressants or opioids and things like that people can become addicted to. But a lot of the things, I think more of the drugs people become addicted to are uppers, or they're stimulants, or they're things that stimulate dopamine. And basically dopamine is the molecule of motivation. So it's kind of like the increase in dopamine motivates you to move forward, to take action, to do stuff. So if your dopamine levels are very low, then you won't be motivated. And then if something increases your dopamine levels, you feel motivated for a while. And then when your dopamine levels stay elevated, there's no more increase and your motivation drops off again. So it seems to me that a lot of what people do just to navigate their day has to do with keeping their dopamine levels somewhat elevated. Like when you get up in the morning, you've got to have a reason to get up or something to motivate you to get out of bed, which will be something that stimulates dopamine. And anything really that's pleasurable or that you look forward to or that you positively anticipate can stimulate dopamine. So if you're really looking forward to your cup of coffee when you get out of bed, that can stimulate dopamine. And it helps that caffeine is a stimulant, which further helps to stimulate dopamine. But you can also look forward to sugar, or you can look forward to some kind of drug, or you could look forward to a social interaction that you're going to have that day, or you could look forward to an activity that you're really passionate and excited about. But one way or another, you've got to have something to look forward to, because it's the positive anticipation that stimulates dopamine, which is what motivates action. If you don't have something to increase your dopamine levels, then you'll just lay there in bed all day, which is what people who are depressed do. And one of the things that goes with depression is like lower dopamine levels. So the to me, it just makes a lot of sense in sort of what motivates us to go throughout the day. It's either something positive that we anticipate, or if in the absence of that, then we'll find whatever we can, which will, in our modern environment, is likely to be some sort of stimulant that's going to generate dopamine, because otherwise we just can't do anything.
Yeah. And in listening to your talk there, I realized that I misspoke. I think I might have said oxytocin when what I meant to say was Oxycontin in terms of the painkiller. But yeah, absolutely. And in fact, just as a personal aside, I've gone through some different experiments with thinking about like alcohol and whatnot in my own life. And so I went through some experiments of trying not having it part of my life. I went through a year where I didn't have any alcohol at all, and then gave myself a month to experiment with it again to see if I wanted to include it or not. And I went, excuse me, and I went back to not having it at all. And it's actually coming up on 3 years now that I haven't had any alcohol, and it's been an interesting transition. But in my case, I did not like when I would have something to drink, it wasn't for the depressive effect and the sense of like I didn't ever like actually being drunk. I'm maybe too much of a control freak in that sense. But there was other pieces of it that I liked that was maybe more tied into like why people like hot sauce. It's like there's something about that burn or whatever that just gives you like a little bit of this endorphin rush type thing. And I think there was an aspect of that with drinking. But the thing that has always been much more of a motivator in my case has been things that are more mind enhancing or sharpening. So the caffeine, yes, but also the nicotine. It's been very interesting to see where nicotine has gone now with these non-tobacco forms and non-vaping forms that have been being used as like nootropics. And it'll be interesting to see where that whole science goes and what the ultimate implications of that are. But yeah, there's that dopamine concept, and the things that are motivational or the things that light things up and get you going are the things that are important in human life, to have something to look forward to that is hopefully something that is productive. Like you said, if you can be excited about, the job that you're doing or an event that's coming up or a project you're working on, these are really important. If the thing that gets you out of bed in the morning is looking for that sugar hit, of course, that's not necessarily a good thing. But yeah, those are some key aspects of this. And it gets back into, again, when we think about this managing or governing, how do we create contexts in which things can flourish? And or are we taking more short-sighted, quick profit type of approaches to things in terms of how our governments or our companies are run that ultimately just use up people and resources and create an unsustainable situation? So I really think we're at a point in history where this is maybe even more vital of a question to be addressed, given the potential outcomes that we're facing right now at more of a global level. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming today. And if you're watching this as a video and you'd like to be a part of our live Friday morning Zoom discussions, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and you'll get a weekly email with the latest videos as well as links to join us here. And if you happen to be in the Southern California area, where you can meet up in person. So with that, hopefully we'll see everybody next week, and have a great week.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks.